When anti-racism protesters in the UK marched through the streets of Bristol and toppled the statue of Edward Colston, they successfully managed not only to destroy one of the city's landmarks, but to spawn a debate within a debate. No longer were we required to ask only if the UK is a structurally racist society, but if the monuments that stand throughout our cities are indeed symbols of racism that need to be torn down with a great sense of urgency, lest our streets continue to be bedecked with eulogies to white supremacy that might offend some, whilst inspiring others to repeat the evils of the past. Whatever one's stance on the question at hand might be, one thing is certain, which is that the nation has entered into a state of cultural panic. If you have watched any of my videos on structural racism in the UK, then you will know why I believe that it can be said without hesitation that despite being a nation that has statues to those who have profited from the slave trade, we have successfully managed to create a multi-ethnic society that does not suffer from the ills of institutional racism. To put it simply, statues have not stood in our way, and they haven't prevented us from making immense progress in expunging the evil of racism. This, in and of itself, with regards to actually combating racism, makes the actions of the protesters in Bristol nothing more than an empty gesture, a mass exercise in virtue signalling, or a veritable collective orgy of moral masturbation. But all of this can be said whilst recognising the fact that not all acts of taking down statues are necessarily unjustified. To give an obvious example, when the Allied armies invaded Germany in 1945, high explosive was liberally applied to the grotesque monuments that the Nazis had erected across their 1,000-year Reich. Indeed, if the people of Bristol can now be allowed to take part in a referendum on the question of whether the statue should be repaired, a collective decision to get rid of the statue, rather than have it torn down by the mob, would be perfectly justified. If the residents of the city think that Colston's involvement in the slave trade far outweighs his good deeds as someone who used his wealth to alleviate the sufferings of Bristol's poor, then surely it must be for them to make such a decision. But the basis on which we make such decisions seems to have become somewhat confused of late. One can't help but think that the logic at work is that of the Puritan, seeking to find and expose whatever sins can be found in a person's past, and then demanding that they be written off as an individual worthy of any form of public remembrance. This certainly seems to be the case with regards to the vandalism of Winston Churchill's statue in Parliament Square. A statue of Robert Baden-Powell has also been marked for removal, and even episodes of Fawlty Towers have been withdrawn from screening services, along with the 1939 classic Gone with the Wind. The mindset at work is encapsulated by the story that is told of a group of women who went to meet Dr. Samuel Johnson after the publication of his Dictionary of the English Language. The women congratulated Johnson on not having included any rude words in his dictionary, and he in turn thanked them for having made such an effort to look for them. Offence can be found in all quarters, provided that we look for it with sufficient zeal and determination. Surely the superior way of approaching the issue is to ask in each individual case what is the actual functional significance of the statues and monuments in question. What do they actually symbolise to the public at large, and as such, what role do they play in our national life? Let us take the example of Nelson's column. The Guardian journalist Afua Hirsch has called into question the moral legitimacy of the statue due to Nelson's investments in the slave trade, as well as his vocal opposition to Britain's abolitionists. Just as others have tried to highlight his involvement in the suppression of a popular uprising in the city of Naples, branding him the Butcher of Naples for the rough justice that he was prepared to mete out. This is indeed a side of Nelson that many are not aware of, and it isn't something that should be covered up or forgotten about. The duty of the historian is to try and tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so that others who are not specialists can make an informed judgment. But surely the most important question that has to be asked is, what does Nelson's column actually symbolise for the majority of us who look at it? Surely the overwhelming response has to be that it is a symbol of British defiance to foreign domination and a symbol of triumph over those who would have sought to violate our national sovereignty. And one wonders what the harm in this really is. How many people are genuinely in danger of looking at the column and then deciding to re-evaluate their position on the moral question of whether it is okay or not to enslave one's fellow man? Much the same can also be said of the adoration of Winston Churchill. Nobody reveres Churchill in order to try and revamp his ideas on the moral legitimacy of the British Empire. Instead, we lionise him as the man who led the resistance against the greatest evil of the 20th century. There really is no serious basis to the idea that it is really a secret or crypto-Machiavellian way of winking at modern-day racists and telling them to carry on with the good work. Just as Baden-Powell's presence on Poole Quayside is not a calculated attempt to stir racial tensions, but instead is a celebration of a man who has, through the creation of the Scouting movement, brought and continues to bring joy to the lives of millions of young people around the globe. Much the same can be said about the statue of Cecil Rhodes that adorns Oriel College, Oxford. What genuine harm the rather unimpressive monument is doing is not obvious to anyone but the protesters who gather below it with pious faces of strained indignation, gathering together during a pandemic and running the very credible risk that people might now die of coronavirus as a result of their decision to gather together to shout at a piece of masonry. One can't but help feel that the real motivation for such protests is not the need to counter racism, but instead the desire to service the unlimited sense of self-regard of the protesters themselves. There is another context to all of this, which is one of blatant, though predictable hypocrisy. Notably, there exists another memorial in London which celebrates a middle-class white man who was a virulent anti-Semite. This monument, of course, won't be assailed by the mob because it is that of Karl Marx. Similarly, the statue of Gandhi in Tavistock Square is seldom graffitied for his racist views on the moral worth of black Africans. Will anyone demand that the city of Liverpool tear down its statue of Muhammad Ali, the man who for a long time publicly insisted that black people were superior to white people and that integration was a fiction, in no small part because of his belief in the quite literal existence of white people as agents of the devil? No doubt their racism can receive a free pass. And there is one other final context which also deserves a mention, which is that of forgiveness. Douglas Murray, in his recent book The Madness of Crowds, tries to draw our attention towards the work of the German philosopher Hannah Arendt. In particular, her idea that when we approach the past, we should be willing to do so with an ability to forgive those who made mistakes which were in no small part conditioned by the time in which they lived. If we have no such faculty for forgiveness, then nearly the whole study of history becomes one long dismal act of moral retribution. There ceases to be much to inspire us about humans who have come before us, but plenty of opportunities to indulge our chosen grievances. If we take the statue of the warrior princess Boudica, which stands on the banks of the Thames in central London, can we seriously expect that she would have passed the moral criteria by which we seek to disparage so many others? Would she have had the correct views with regards to human beings with different coloured skin, on homosexuality or trans rights? Would she have seen the virtues of the European Union, or have been willing to join Extinction Rebellion and campaign against the evils of fossil fuels? We of course have no written records of what the woman thought on any topic, let alone any of these. Yet, as anachronistic as some of them are, it is not difficult to think that in an alternative universe in which we could travel in time and ask her such questions, that she surely would have offended at least one of our modern-day sensibilities, and as such, her right to a statue would probably have to be voided. A supreme example of the virtue of forgiveness in action was on display when Nelson Mandela visited London in 2003 to celebrate the establishment of the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, which would supply funding for the education of young academics and for the advancement of education and learning around the world. Mandela urged us to forgive the crimes of the past, and as he termed it, celebrate the amicable closing of a historic circle. A circle that is in itself much like the circle of hatred, one to be broken rather than constantly revitalized. The appearance of far-right activists across the country on a mission to guard the nation's memorials is only sad proof of the fact that mob justice will only beget further mob justice.